Hi, I'm Lynn Cohick. I'm the Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Director of Houston Theological Seminary at Houston Christian University in wonderful Houston, Texas.
Dr. Lynn Cohick. Lynn, welcome back to Exegetically Speaking.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for inviting me back.
It's great to see you here in Houston in one of the coolest summers we've had in a long time.
I'm not believing you.
No, it's been pretty brutal this year, but we're so glad to see you and welcome. First of all, congratulations on your new appointment.
Thank you. Yes, excited to start up at Houston Christian University. I'm very thrilled to be with my new colleagues here and close to you.
Yeah, not far away at all.
No, not in Texas terms anyway.
No. It's only 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Right around the corner.
Right around the corner. That's right. We'd walk it if we could, but we can't.
Not in this heat.
Not in this heat at all. Hey, today we're going to talk about Ephesians 5. You've been with us before, so we don't need to introduce you again. But Ephesians 5 is an amazing passage. There are some technical aspects to it that we're going to talk about today, and maybe even some text-critical aspects as well. So set this up for us, Ephesians 5:21 and following. What's happening here?
Right. Well, this is where Paul addresses the household using something from his culture that we now call the household codes. The household codes were established hundreds of years earlier with Aristotle as he thought about the body politic and the city-state of Athens. And he thought about family as having husband and wife, parent and children, and owners and slaves. And those were the three pairs. The pairs were arranged hierarchically, so you had the superordinate and the subordinate in each of those pairs. And for Aristotle, it wasn't simply a matter of order, but there was a hierarchical order, right? So it wasn't based on merit that you had an ordered structure, but the value. We see this most, of course, in the owner-slave, where from Aristotle's standpoint, the slave was a human tool. Mm-hmm. So Paul inherits this structure in society. It's kind of just part of the culture. And he knows that the gospel speaks into any situation. And so his congregation lives in this world that has these structures, and he begins to teach them about what the house church looks like, because, of course, the congregations now are meeting in homes.
Right.
And they live in this cultural structure. So what does that mean? How do I live out the gospel in my context? That's really what Paul is doing here at the end of chapter 5. And as you mentioned, we often think that the argument starts at 5:21. But you could make a case, actually, from a grammatical standpoint, that Paul actually begins talking about this. He's leading up to a subject starting in 5:18. Mm-hmm. There you have a command, be filled with the Spirit. And following that command, being filled with the Spirit, then you have all of these wonderful examples of being filled with the Spirit, speaking to each other in psalms, hymns, making music from your heart, giving thanks to God the Father and everything. And all of those descriptors are grammatically connected back to the main verb, which is to be filled with the Spirit, that command, be filled with the Spirit.
And each of those are participles, too. They're not really main verbs driving it. They're sort of just I think they're sort of describing what life in the Spirit looks like. Exactly.
So we know that the Ephesians are already sealed with the Spirit. The Spirit is among them. So when Paul commands be filled with the Spirit, it's like he's saying, live into what you have. And this is how your community should be shaped. So when you think about speaking in psalms and hymns, making music, giving thanks, I mean, you kind of think of church service, right?
Yeah.
And so that fifth participle is submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ. But in our English translations, we often shorten Paul's sentences. Sometimes they're just a little too long anyway for us English speakers. And so often in our English translations, verse 5:21 is a separate sentence. But actually, from the standpoint of the Greek, it's just the fifth participle in a line of participles that go back up to telling us what it looks like to be filled with the Spirit. So sometimes our English translations will have a heading that will come in between verses 20 and 21, or sometimes in between 21 and 22. But I think from Paul's standpoint, it's one big flow. Yeah.
He's just thinking of it in those terms, and it makes a lot of sense now that you tied it to the house church. As they gather, they're doing these things, and then this certainly has implications for what it means to be family people in that culture.
Exactly.
And Paul very often is understood as sort of turning some things Aristotle said upside down in ways.
Well, and I think he does it right now as well. As we look into the next verses, 21 and 22, I think he flips Aristotle's teachings on its head.
Yeah.
I don't know
Not
if he flips
man.
Aristotle.
No.
Although that could be interesting too.
That would be. Yeah.
So we have the fifth participle, submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ. And then verse 22, wives to your husbands as to the Lord. The best manuscript evidence, the oldest, when I say best, I mean the oldest manuscript evidence we have, does not include the participle, again, submit, nor does it include a different verb.
A new verb, yeah.
So when the English, which is fine for the English to repeat the verb found in 21, the participle, wives submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, that's helpful for us speaking in English.
We need that really more than they do.
That's right.
They need that.
That's right. In Greek, it was the assumption was the Greek listener could remember the previous verb. I don't know what it says about English speakers.
Earlier, right? We should be able to say that.
Yeah. So, but for English, we do need to, for correct grammar, need to repeat it. I think what's important is that Paul is linking here in a grammatical sense. He's linking how the church relates to each other, as well as thinking then about one of the central components of family, which is marriage. So then you ask yourself, well, what does this submit mean? And I think what's important to note is that it's often a positive. It has positive connotations. In Paul's day, the honor-shame culture suggested everyone should defer to those who, from a societal standpoint, have more honor. So we say honor your father and mother, right? That's good. And one of the ways we often expect that to be realized is that we submit to their wisdom. We submit to their suggestions. Their ideas carry more weight, you know? And so there's a submissive piece to that that's not at all dishonoring or lowering or negative.
Doesn't make me any lower in the framework of society because I do honor my parents.
Yes, that's right. So that broadly speaking, submit means that. But within the context of Paul's culture, wives were seen as the subordinate members. So now I'm going to switch and use a different term here, subordinate of the pair. So I think what Paul does here, as he says, submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ, wives to your husbands as to the Lord, he's trying to shape what submission for wives looks like by connecting it with the posture that all believers should have towards each other because they're in Christ. And so that, I think that's where...
We see this expressed in Philippians 2 as well, the first part of that at least. And particularly in the hymn, Jesus is described sort of in those ways of humility and deferring and for the other. And as Hurtado says, Jesus is the lordly example. So he is still Lord, but he is an example of humility.
Exactly. Yes. So we have in verse 22, there's not a command for wives to submit. is in later, like 5th century document, a manuscript, we do have a verb that is in the command form, submit. And we have, and as I say, that's a little bit later. It matches Colossians 3:18. We have another slightly earlier manuscript, maybe 4th century, that also uses command form and imperative of the verb submit, but that rendering is in the 3rd person plural. So rather than, as Paul uses with everybody else in the household codes, that 2nd person plural, you or y'all, the 4th century manuscript uses 3rd person. So they're kind of making a statement. Wives, it's sort of in general. He's not speaking to the wives. He's just making a general comment
about the way things are.
The way things are.
In his culture at that time.
Right. So I'm less persuaded that this verb that's in the 3rd person plural imperative, that came from Paul's pen, because it doesn't fit with how he addresses all the other significant categories in this household codes. And I just don't see it. It would be kind of a dismissal, like the wives don't exist, which would actually be very typical of how wives are talked about by men like Plutarch and others at this
Aristotle
time, right?
Too, as well.
Certainly Aristotle, and then up through to Paul's day and the Stoic reference.
With him is more like, men, keep your wives submissive.
Oh, yes.
He addressed the men. But what strikes me as honoring here is that Paul addresses women.
That's right.
In this thing, and make them equal partners in a way.
Yes.
That's a remarkable moment.
Exactly right. And so when you know the Greek, you realize that a strong case can be made. I think that it's the best case, that Paul just reiterates or asks the reader to remember, submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ, wives to your husbands as to the Lord. And even in verse 24, now as the church submits to Christ, that's an indicative, so also wives to their husbands. Paul does not repeat submit. Yet in some of our English translations we say, so also wives should submit, or in some way, again, try to get that imperative back in there.
Make it an ought kind of statement. You ought to do this kind of thing.
Right, as though there's a command in there, but there's not. I mean, the only verb that's there is in the indicative. So it's intriguing to me how from the 4th century on, it feels like there was an Aristotelian push.
They lost a little ground, one might say, at that point.
Yes. Whereas I think for Paul, he really saw the gospel as suggesting a mutuality in marriage that did not see the Aristotelian picture of male as normative and female as inferior. And I think this lives out even in his text.
Ultimately, those kind of ideas win, right? And they begin turning the world upside down, as it says in the book of Acts. These fellows are turning the world upside down.
Praise the Lord.
That's a good thing. Dr.
Yes.
Lynn Cohick, great to see you today, and welcome back to Exegetically Speaking. We'll see you again, I hope.
I hope so, too. Thank you, David.
What a great conversation. I hope you agree. Now, there's only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to this podcast, rate us today. If you want to study biblical languages, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Come on, you know you want to. Thanks for those who make this podcast possible. John Lonsma is our Wheaton-based director, Ian Rosine, and Rebecca Larson. Thanks to Phil Keke for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.